Hello, everybody. My name is Isaac Archuleta, and I'm here with Jamie Leach. And
Hello.
And we're two therapists who operate out of Denver, Colorado. And I've worked really closely with Q Christian for a very long time. And one of the things that I feel most passionate about is talking about healthy relationships. I think that there's a big part of us, a big group of us as well, that are hungry for deep connection. I think as a therapist, hearing stories about what does it take to make true love work and finding a partner or partners out there is a big question. So we wanted to take some time and go through briefly some attachment stuff and some of the effects of what happened to us when we're closeted and experiencing something called either enmeshment or detachment, and how that sets us up to operate or to assume a certain role in relationships that might not be helpful if we're trying to make long-lasting love work. So we're gonna kind of dive in.
We realized that we could actually do a whole breakout session on just attachment alone. So we wanted to actually show you what we thought was a really well-constructed YouTube video that will give you an idea of what the basic types of attachment are. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how that relates to the conversation today. So we're going to pull that up for you here.
Let's do it.
Colorado newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News, in July 1985. The history of 20th century psychology had a modest start in the pages of a local Colorado newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News, in July 1985. The work of two University of Denver psychologists, Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver, the questionnaire asked readers to identify which of three statements most closely reflected who they were in love. To hugely improve our chances of thriving in relationships, we should dare to take the same test. Option A: I find it relatively easy to get close to others and am comfortable depending on them and having them depend on me. I don't worry about being abandoned or about someone getting too close to me. Option B: I find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like. I often worry that my partner doesn't really love me or won't want to stay with me. I want to get very close to my partner, and this sometimes scares people away. Option C: I am somewhat uncomfortable being close to others. I find it difficult to trust them completely, difficult to allow myself to depend on them. I'm nervous when anyone gets too close, and often others want me to be more intimate than I feel comfortable being. Which of these options applies to you? A, B, or C? Behind the scenes, the options refer to the three main styles of relating to other people, first identified by the English psychologist John Bowlby, the inventor of attachment theory in the 1950s and 60s. Option A signals what is known as a secure pattern of attachment, whereby love and trust come easily. Option B refers to what's known as the anxious pattern of attachment, where one longs to be intimate with others, but is continuously scared of letdown and often precipitates crises in relationships through counterproductively aggressive behavior. Option C is what is known as the avoidant pattern of attachment, where it feels much easier to avoid the dangers of intimacy through solitary activities and emotional withdrawal. Questionnaires in newspapers are rarely of much use, but Hazan and Shaver's is the momentous exception. If there is one thing we should do to improve our relationships, it is to know ahead of time which of the three categories we predominantly belong to, A, B, or C, and to deploy the knowledge in love so as to warn ourselves and others of the traps we might fall into. We then need a little training because half of us at least are not secure in love. We belong in the camps of either the avoidant or the anxious, and we have, to complicate matters, an above average propensity to fall in love with someone from the other damaged side, thereby aggravating our insecurities and defenses in the process. Here is a brief list of what avoidance and anxious types should keep in mind in their relationships. If you are an avoidant with someone anxiously attached, well, recognize the extent to which you check out emotionally when things are intense, particularly when there is an offer of closeness. Recognize how you will tend to prefer sex and closeness with strangers and how nervous you will be around cuddles and kissing. You probably don't want to keep the light on either. Watch how you sabotage long-term intimacy. Have compassion that you are afraid of what you really want. Think back to how in your past, closeness would have been frightening because people let you down, and observe how you adopted a strategy of removal to protect yourself. You are hurt, not bad. Remind yourself that the present is different from the past and that you are ruining the present by bringing to it fear-laden dynamics that don't actually belong there. It may feel like your partner is being aggressive and ill-tempered with you for no reason. They are at heart upset and unable to express their needs in any other way. They want you, and that's why they are behaving as they are. Look beneath their nagging and their accusations and believe in their underlying goodwill. When they attack you, see their longing for love. Do that very frightening thing. Extend reassurance and explain calmly the appeal of the cave. If you are an anxious person with an avoidant partner, here are some other things to bear in mind. Things are not necessarily as bad as they seem. The other person's quiet might just be quiet, not a lack of love. Their distance isn't necessarily meanness. It might be their way of maintaining equilibrium. On the other hand, you are not demented or needy to want more, but your way of dealing with what you legitimately need may be aggravating things hugely. You might be triggering your partner by asking for intimacy too directly and also probably with too much anger. Realize that you need to tread lightly and to be a little distant in requesting closeness. Your partner isn't mean or freakish, merely damaged as a you, and that's very normal. A full 40% of the population are in your positions, either insecurely attached or anxiously attached. Knowing whether we can be classed as secure, avoidant, or anxious in love should be a basic fact we grasp about ourselves. The next step is to accept with grace that if we are either avoidant or anxious, we're going to need considerable emotional schooling to get out of scratchy patterns and stand a chance of building up a good enough relationship.
Our relationships book calmly guides us with calm and charm through the key issues of relationships.
I did want to say real quickly, I forgot to mention that at the very top of the chat box, I posted a link to a PDF. It's hiding out in a Dropbox folder, and we're going to go through that PDF today. We wanted something that would something you could download on your computer, maybe an iPad, you can take notes, but we wanted something available for you. So that's at the very top of the chat box.
That's great. So if you open that up, you're going to see that we'll talk a little bit about those 3 different types of attachment styles that were in the video. And I like to think about attachment more as existing on a spectrum. So you have things that are on the extremes, right? Mental health, for example, tends to go on a spectrum between rigidity and chaos. And relationships tend to exist on an attachment spectrum between avoidant and anxious. And then sometimes, if you've heard the term disorganized attachment, that's going to be where somebody's kind of going back and forth and they're oscillating along that spectrum in unpredictable ways. And sometimes people think that they're in more like a disorganized state along that spectrum if they notice that in different relationships they are experiencing more avoidant tendencies or more anxious tendencies, but that's actually not the right definition for disorganized. Disorganized is that through probably trauma and other things that have happened in that person's life, they're not able to know when it is that they're going to be on the extreme side of anxious or on the extreme side of avoidant. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Most of us, just like anything else, if you're familiar with like a bell curve, right? Most of us are actually going to be hanging out somewhere on that spectrum in the middle part, but leaning a little bit more avoidant or leaning a little bit more anxious. And what we also may find is that the closer to middle that we are, is that we may be adaptable. So if you're in a relationship with somebody who's showing more anxious tendencies, your attachment style with them actually may lean a little bit more avoidant. And the same way, if you're with if you're in a relationship with somebody who leans a little bit more avoidant, then you might find that you're exhibiting some anxious traits, a little bit more preoccupied and worried about the relationship. So I think it's really important to know that this is something that does exist on a spectrum, and that is an important thing for kind of a little bit more of the empowering part of how we actually work through this, and utilize attachment to our benefit and the knowledge of it, and making sure that whatever relationship structures we're in, we're moving more toward that earned secure attachment. And so Isaac's going to explain a little bit more about the understanding piece around, especially as queer people, being in the closet or going through the process, or even being people who come out later in life, the things that may happen through that can lead to some of these different attachment styles, but also cycles within the relationship. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I will screen share the chart that we're looking over. This chart is the PDF that is in Dropbox. So if you scroll all the way down, there's the streamer performer chart here that I want to take a look at with y'all. Let me see if I can move this over. There we go. Okay. So basically, when we think about the two big words here are enmeshment and detachment. And as a queer psychotherapist, one of the things that I see is that the enmeshment happens to almost all of us. And now that's changing throughout generations, which is a great thing. But generally speaking, enmeshment is the idea that we are in charge of managing someone else's emotional reactions. And this goes to everything outside of us. I'm in charge of managing my mom and dad's disappointment if I come out. I'm in charge of managing God's emotions and making sure that God is happy with and pleased with who I am, my job, my boss, and so forth and so on. This enmeshment comes from, it's very subtle and can be very subconscious, but it comes from the one-liners of "you made me really angry" or "you pissed me off." That's a boundaryless statement that says you're in charge of managing my emotional reactions. And from a clinical perspective, that's very erroneous. It's not how it works. So when we're enmeshed with, we're kind of like scanning the environment, making sure that we're managing the wind and where it's coming from. And we're trying to keep this emotional climate in check by managing and filtering who we are. The slogans here up at the top of the chart: "I am valuable when I meet others' expectations and rescue them from pain." This is my favorite one because it really depicts the performer and the side effects of enmeshment really well. I need to be spectacular to earn my value. And that spectacularity comes in the way we do our hair, the way we dress, the way we speak, the kind of education we have. We want to be spectacular in every area as a way of earning value. I need to care for others. If I don't, I feel incredibly guilty, is another line. And the final one: being close scares me because I lose my identity and individuality in relationships. Enmeshment, I'm going to take us through this little cycle here, but when we suffer from enmeshment, we enter the relationship to earn our value and avoid feeling guilt. We want to be spectacular and we want to protect people from disappointment in who we are. What we're doing here, if we go into the light gray box, is we're using something called the illusion of control. Now, this is the illusion that we can be a relational superhero and we can please everybody around us. If I am perfect and spectacular, no one can not love me. What we do here is we use obligation as our motivation. I have to keep them happy. and we lose our own sense of self-love by letting our desires be our compass guiding us forward. As a performer suffering from all of this enmeshment, we lose the captain role on our own ship. We become a relational chameleon. So with this kind of relational software, we start performing for everybody. I like to call it the ta-das. Ta-da, look it, I'm closeted and pretending to be straight. Ta-da, I'm hiding this part of my personality because it might piss you off. Ta-da, I'll move to this city even though I hate it, because if I don't move there, you'll leave me. Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. And we kind of build this whole life and this whole identity based off of saying yes to things we didn't want to. It can be a relationship we want to leave, sex that we don't want to have, again, moving to a city that we don't want. And so enmeshment can be really, really powerful. I really like to make enmeshment, I'm going to pause from the chart for just a second and say that enmeshment is a very powerful force. It is saying a good son, in my case, would protect me from the failure of having a queer kid as a parent. So the longer Isaac stays closeted, the happier I am. And the message here is I need to protect others from my authenticity. That is the powerful voice of enmeshment. So now back to the chart. In this green box where we're ta-daing, it feels comfortable at first because it brings a lot of spectacularity our way. One of my favorite authors says that a performer will fall in love with the way people fall in love with them. And I think that's really powerful. What happens in that system, though, is the ta-das start to become overwhelming, too uncomfortable, too painful. And we start to pull away from the relationship. We're kind of in that peach box down at the bottom. We want to swap out all of that spectacularity for resentment and anger. In this place, we're going to feel like a failure. I can't keep you happy with who I am. Everything I do isn't enough. You're never going to be fully happy with me. So now I feel just shamed, depleted, exhausted, and sometimes even anxious that I can't keep you close enough to me. So then what we'll do, we'll create this distance from relationships and we'll kind of take a relational vacation. We'll hide behind busyness, we'll screen all the phone calls, we'll leave people on red, we'll take an excuse to get out of there. And then in the purple box, we feel guilty for being away for too long. So we dive back in with another spectacular ta-da. And this is where we see people love bomb or seduction bomb other people. We're afraid of being abandoned, so we panic and we love bomb someone. Or we're so sick and tired of all of the ta-das that this person is required of us. And I say that in quotes because, again, this is our perception of relationships, that we can lose all energy and leave for a new relationship. On the flip side, we have what I call the dreamer. And the dreamer is someone who experiences the detachment. So the performer is craving, or excuse me, the performer is set up by enmeshing with someone. The dreamer is set up by being detached from someone. And so they make a good puzzle because the dreamer is craving enmeshment now, and the performer is craving detachment. So now they're playing out this role where they're going to connect really well. So if you look at the color coding of the chart, it kind of works like cogs, and they line up a little too perfectly. For the dreamer on the left side, their detachment has been so painful that now all they want is enmeshment, and they want the superhero that they can find in a performer. So they enter the relationship to feel safe and rescued. And in the light gray box, they create this whole fantasy of how the superhero will rescue them and what that rescuing will look like and what it will do for them. Now they go into the turquoise box and they assume that the superhero is actually their superhero. They feel rescued, it feels blissful. The performer is taking care of all of the dreamer's needs. And what happens as the performer on the right-hand side slips down into being overwhelmed, the dreamer on the left side begins to experience this shattering, that their world is falling apart, that the superhero actually isn't willing to rescue them. And because they're not being rescued, they're no longer valuable. This shattering down here in the peach box at the bottom is really painful. So then they shoot up into this very, very painful yellow box where they can panic, experience intense anxiety, they have shame, they can be rageful, and then they pop up into their white bubble. The performer on the other side is busy, they've pieced out, and the dreamer is obsessing and medicating. Where did you go? Who are you with? Why did you do this to me? Why are we not having fun anymore? And so then they have their reactions. If the performer does option number 1 and they lean back in, the dreamer reestablishes their fantasy. If the performer does option number 2 and they kind of lean back in out of this fear and panic, the dreamer can feel relationally secure. And for the dreamer, option number 3 is if the relationship falls apart or if the dreamer can't sustain this pain and the anxiety anymore, oftentimes they will grasp for a brand new relationship. So the reason why I wanted to go through this is to say, sometimes enmeshment and detachment, it allows us to assume a role that says, I either need to be spectacular in relationships to earn my value, or I am so valueless, I need someone spectacular to validate me. And from those roles, we will blend with our attachment style. And I think this is where, as clinicians, we see a lot of that friction that makes long-lasting love fall apart. I did see James raise a hand.
We can't see any of you, unfortunately. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A.
Yes.
And we're gonna
think
create some
Tom's here.
time for that
Yeah.
there at the beginning. So you can see in the chat box that the host kind of placed a little space for that, but just know that we will get your questions. You know, of course, we wish we could see your faces.
Yes.
And kind of create a little bit more of like that engaging and an intimate environment, but hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit more of that here at the end.
So one question that came in, what if you switch styles depending on the relationship, or both if you show both styles, you can hop back and forth. A lot of performers, when they're in their purple box and they're experiencing the anxiety, it can look like a dreamer. Of course, a dreamer can also look like a performer. The one major key is to say, what is my motivation? Am I motivated to earn value with this behavior, or am I motivated to feel like I need to be rescued? And from that position, you can oftentimes begin to splice them or kind of disentangle them and really identify with one more than the other.
So along with this, we wanted to also show you another little video just to give you a little bit more of an expanded view of understanding how when we're closeted as youth and when we're in our family of origins, the different types of parenting styles around that may actually impact a little bit more in terms of the way in which we would show up in our attachment styles and adult relationships too. So we're gonna go to that real quick.
We have a choice in becoming the people we strive to be. It is without a doubt that our childhoods shape us to a certain extent. How we choose to react to different situations and the way we express ourselves are behavioral patterns that are formed starting at a young age when we first begin to learn how to make sense of our immediate environment. Marriage and family counselors Dr. Milan and Kay Yurkovic discovered that everyone has a certain love style.
Oh, we can't hear the video anymore.
Giving comfort to their reactive parent. Pleasers are uncomfortable with conflict and deal with disagreements by often giving in or making up for them quickly. They usually have a hard time saying no, and because they want to minimize conflict, they may not be truthful and lie to avoid difficult confrontation.
Sorry, we're gonna restart this just because apparently it was muted. Sorry. Okay, there we go.
Although we have a choice in becoming the people we strive to be, it is without a doubt that our childhoods shape us to a certain extent. How we choose to react to different situations and the way we express ourselves are behavioral patterns that are formed starting at a young age when we first begin to learn how to make sense of our immediate environment. Marriage and family counselors Dr. Milan and Kay Yurkovic discovered that everyone has a certain love style based on their upbringing. A love style is comprised of our tendencies and inclinations of how we respond to our romantic partners. By understanding how we love, we can learn how our love styles affect our relationships. Here are Dr. Milan and Kay Yurkovic's 5 love styles. 1. The pleaser. The pleaser often grows up in a home with an overly protective or angry and critical parent. As children, pleasers do everything they can to be good and be on their best behavior, so as to not provoke a negative response from their parent. Pleaser children don't receive comfort. Instead, they spend their time and energy giving comfort to their reactive parent. Pleasers are uncomfortable with conflict and deal with disagreements by often giving in or making up for them quickly. They usually have a hard time saying no, and because they want to minimize conflict, they may not be truthful and lie to avoid difficult confrontations. As pleaser children grow into adults, they learn to read the moods of others around them to make sure they can keep everyone happy. However, when pleasers feel stressed or believe that they are continuously letting someone down, they can have a breakdown and flee from relationships. Pleasers often spread themselves thin, trying to be everything to everyone when it's not realistic. And instead of forming healthy boundaries for themselves, they focus more on the needs and desires of others. In order for pleasers to cultivate stable relationships, they have to be honest about their own feelings, rather than trying to do what is expected of them. 2. The victim. The victim often grows up in a chaotic home. Victims learn to be compliant in order to survive by putting less attention on themselves so they can stay under the radar. To deal with their angry, violent parents, victim children learn at a very young age to hide and stay quiet. Because being fully present is painful for them, victim children often build an imaginary world in their heads to cope with the dangers they face on a daily basis. Victims have low self-esteem and usually struggle with anxiety and depression. They may end up marrying controllers who mirror the same behaviors as their parents. Victims learn to cope by being adaptable and going with the flow. They are so used to chaos and stressful situations that when they do experience calmness, it actually makes them feel uneasy because they anticipate the next blow-up. In order for victims to cultivate healthy, stable relationships, they have to learn self-love and stand up for themselves when a situation calls for it, instead of letting their partner walk all over them. 3. The controller. The controller usually grows up in a home where there wasn't a lot of protection, so they learn to toughen up and take care of themselves. They need to feel in control at all times to prevent the vulnerability they experienced in their childhood from being exposed in their adulthood. People with this love style believe that they're in control when they can avoid experiencing negative feelings of fear, humiliation, and helplessness. Controllers, however, don't associate anger as vulnerability, so they use it as a weapon to remain in power. Controllers have rigid tendencies, but may also be sporadic and unpredictable. They don't like stepping out of their comfort zones because it makes them feel weak and unprotected. They prefer to solve problems on their own and like getting things done in a certain manner. Otherwise, they get angry. In order for controllers to form stable, long-lasting relationships, they need to learn how to let go, trust others, and keep their anger at bay. 4. The vacillator. The vacillator often grows up with an unpredictable parent. As children, vacillators learned that their needs aren't their parents' top priority. Without consistent affection from their parent, vacillators develop a deep fear of abandonment. But when the parent finally feels like giving their time and attention to them, vacillators are usually too angry and tired to receive it. As vacillators enter adulthood, they try to find the consistent love they were deprived of as children. Vacillators have a tendency to idealize new relationships, but once they feel let down or disappointed, they grow dejected and doubtful. They often feel misunderstood and experience a lot of internal conflict and emotional stress within their relationships. They can be extremely sensitive and perceptive, which allows them to detect even the slightest change in others and know when people are pulling away. In order for vacillators to cultivate healthy, stable relationships, they need to learn how to pace themselves and get to know someone before committing too soon and getting hurt by their own expectations. 5. The avoider. The avoider often grows up in a less affectionate home that values independence and self-reliance. As children, avoiders learn to take care of themselves starting at a very young age. and put their feelings and needs on hold to deal with their anxieties of having little to no comfort from their parents. Avoiders tend to like their space and rely on logic and detachment more than their emotions. They get uncomfortable when people around them experience intense mood swings. In order for avoiders to cultivate healthy, long-lasting relationships, they need to learn how to open up and express their emotions honestly. Which love style do you identify with? Please share your thoughts with us below. Also, we'd love to give special thanks to our sponsors, BetterHelp.
Awesome.
Mhm.
So one of the reasons why I really like kind of meshing attachment and these 5 styles with the dreamer performer chart is they give us a really good description of what the enmeshment and the detachment do to us and how we assume a role in relationships. I believe that when we're closeted, it is possible to do both. It's possible to say, I need to stay in here so that I can keep people close to me, attached to me, and pleased with who I am and how I'm showing up in the world. I think in some doctrines, and if we apply some orthodoxies to who we are, I think we learn that this is what we have to do with God as well. I have to perform in a certain way in order to keep God pleased with who I am and close enough to who I am. And so I really want to hammer out that I think one of the other biggest things that we do when we're in the closet and we come out is we leave our emotional desires in the closet oftentimes. We say, I can come out, but my truest desires have to stay in there, because being this queer person, it doesn't afford me bringing out my queerness and all of my desires. I can only come out and share just fractions of who I am. And I believe that enmeshment is really, it's very, very thick for a lot of us. So I think that's one of the biggest factors that I see in relationships that infuse unhealthy attachment styles, but also these 5 in this last video.
Yeah, it's definitely. And so you can see that this particular topic starts to get pretty deep and it starts to get pretty broad. And just kind of a little touch point on that is that it also can sometimes feel a little rigid, like, oh, I'm only this one, or I'm this one, or sometimes some of us, myself included, can see the ways in which maybe we were all of those 5 styles, or maybe times when we were the dreamer, times when we were the performer, depending on different relationship. And so our goal in this is really to expose you to knowing that there's ways of understanding yourself, to give the insight to know what it is that you're actually maybe doing, or what you're leaning toward, or why things are happening the way they are, so that you can make conscious choices in your relationships to move kind of a little bit more toward what we call that earned secure attachment. So moving a little bit more into the hopeful part of our message is talking a bit more about, like, what do we do, right? So now there's some tools here and there's plenty more out there. Obviously, we're therapists, so we highly encourage utilizing therapy or coaching to be able to kind of go a little bit more in depth with this if you're finding that there's some things that are really clicking and that you're really wanting to explore further in your own life. But I want, and Isaac and I both want to really communicate, right, that the message behind this is hopefulness. So identifying some of these things isn't about staying stuck in a pattern, or feeling like you're identified in a certain way that you can't ever break out of. The good news about attachment is that it's fluid. So it is on a spectrum. And like I said at the beginning, it is dependent on who we're in relationship with. And if you kind of think about it, right, like there's this little bond in between, people. That bond is sort of what is describing what's happening between the two of you. It's almost like this invisible little field. And what we're all trying to do is find some sense of equilibrium within that little field. And we're doing that the best way we know how. And usually we're doing that out of a self-protective place, or we're doing that out of a space, that just is informed, sadly, but like really negatively by our dominant culture, which is not super pro relationship in general. And so it's just a really important thing to know that this this data and this information is really meant to empower you. So that way you can kind of have a little bit more of a sense of like, oh, maybe I'm doing this right now, and that will help me to understand how I could do it differently. So we're going to kind of go into that a little bit more now. So you'll see there on the little outline, right? Attachment is sewn into the fabric of who we are as relational beings, and attachment theory transcends location, culture, gender, sexual orientation, and many other things in relationship. I think it's actually really amazing to realize, and the research proves this, that attachment is something that is universal, at least among humans. We actually see it in animals too, which is really cool. But you can count on this. That's something that is also really powerful about it. Sometimes in a world right now where we're really figuring out so many things and it's really exciting and there's so many open doors, right? It can be nice to have anchor points throughout that. And it can be nice to actually know that there's certain things and there's ways in which the world functions, right? Things that work better than others. And that's still going to be unique within a relationship because every single human is unique. Every relationship structure is unique. But the thing is it's realizing like, oh, there are patterns in communicating, there's patterns in relating that actually tend to work better, that are more functional and lead to greater longevity and satisfaction, if that's what your goal is. So along with all of that, right, the goal in this is not perfection. And it's not about somehow getting your little, meter on the spectrum to right to that middle part and being like, that's where I'm at, I'm secure all the time. It's going to be a process of getting closer to that, right? So it's like if I tend in my kind of anchoring point to lean a little bit more on the anxious side in relationships, I need to be aware of that, but I can do things that help me to move more towards that middle part so that it's not so obvious and so chaotic or disturbing to me, really, right? And the same thing on the avoidance side, right, is like realizing like, okay, I do need to take care of my own personal space or make sure that I have rejuvenating time. But when is it that I'm really kind of like I'm starting to move a little bit away from that middle? And so I can make conscious choices to actually lean in, kind of create some more space there. So just keeping that in mind, again, all of this for the point of really empowering you to know that there's the possibility of being able to change these dynamics. So the narratives that we need to identify and undo in order to have a positive internal relationship, there could be many, and that could be a whole other breakout, and there probably are. There have been both Isaac and I could easily tell you lots of our own stories about this. But the biggest thing is identifying these things in order to find a space of renewal, right? So again, the idea of further exploring and kind of peeling back the layers that hide your whole self. And that's really, really the important piece about this too, is that closeting can happen in so many ways, right? It happens for sure with us in the queer community and is very painful. There's lots of things because of the shame narrative that we adopt as humans that we closet, that we pull back from. And I'm a big believer in creating internal kind of circle of people who are able to see the most of you, that you're able to give, and that may continue to increase over time as you continue to work through the different narratives of things like maybe, I'm not going to give my whole self because they're going to leave anyway, and like kind of peeling back that layer and actually starting to realize like, oh, the beauty of what it looks like when I can actually show up in relationship and I can actually see that they aren't going to leave and I can have a corrective experience. That's what I mean by kind of renewal, the sense of it can continually be the space of like renewing oneself. And in many ways, I feel like that's the hopefulness that we can find too, for sure. And in regards to, lots of different theological ideas behind this, but just that idea of the continual renewal that we can find, in relationship.
Can I say one thing?
Of course.
Okay. I was sitting with a therapist during a time when I was deconstructing all the performer and dreamer and me. And I like this idea of renewal. The therapist that I was seeing at the time used the word remember. And she said, I want you, Isaac, to remember who you are. in terms of that original design. And in Christian spaces, we say the imago Dei, the image and likeness, the form in which I was created. But she didn't mean this like reflective exercise of like remembering who I am, but in this renewal way, she meant, I want you to remember, to put this original member of who you were back into his original form. And I really like this idea of renewal, because it is a remembering of sorts, so we can stay right in that middle, close to zone. So.
Yes, so good. Yeah. So in kind of moving through this, right, finding healing and security, that's going to come in many different ways, and it's as unique as we are as human beings. So that's not a one size fits all. There's a few things here though to kind of take into account, and maybe more kind of awareness, right, of the things that you could kind of start with in order to start pulling back these layers. The first is security in God is the constant relationship. I think that's something that's really powerful to acknowledge, and actually may, be its own process that you have to go through in and of itself, depending on where you're at in your relationship with God. However, the cool part is it's recognizing that God is secure all the time. And what that means is that's a space where we can safely be fully seen. We're always fully seen, right? But we can safely examine where it is when we are fully seen that we tend to leave, right? Am I wanting to move toward God, or am I wanting to pull away from? Am I really worried all the time that I'm not doing enough, or that I'm disappointing God somehow with my actions, right? That might be leaning a little bit more on the anxious side. It's a really powerful place in relationship. There's a reason why God wanted to have relationship with us. It isn't just, because he was bored. It was because I think there's just this beautiful kind of mirroring and this recognition too that there's a whole spectrum in which we're going to fall, right, in our relationship there. But that can be a really powerful place to start, especially in that process, and recognizing too that that's where it also becomes universal. Is that we have lots of different ideas around there, but it's really, what is our relationship to God doing as we are in individuals? Are we actually like talking to, experiencing, and in relationship with God, and moving more toward that middle, and what that takes? So that could be a whole other thing too, but I just wanted to put it out there. And then remembering that secure people attract secure people, and secure people support and maintain security in relationships. So there's a reward for doing this work. It's recognizing that, whether you're in or out of relationship, it's worth it to do this work, because if you're in the process of trying to find a relationship, right, you're going to have a different kind of way of experiencing yourself as a secure person, and that can help you to also then kind of work through the process of bringing security in to your relationship. And then it's something that both people kind of hold, that idea of that attachment space, where it's really finding that element of like, okay, we're both going to hold this up, and if it starts kind of tilting, we're both going to take responsibility for maintaining a little bit more of that equilibrium. So we kind of wanted to put a little caveat in there that if you're in a space right now where you're single, you're not in relationship officially or something like that, the work really can be incredibly powerful to learn how to find this stability within yourself before offering any stability or depending on stability for others. So kind of moving away from that space of being defined by offering something to somebody, or being defined by kind of being rescued by somebody else. And again, that can help to kind of set you up for long-term relationship too.
There are a couple of things that were really, really helpful for me. And the first little piece was boundaries. I think we often talk about boundaries as though it's this protective wall we put up and no one is allowed to penetrate that wall. This idea of you're going to hurt me, so I boundary up. That is fair. The way I like to think of boundaries, and maybe some of you have heard me speak on this before, but I love to think of boundaries like a snow globe. This snow globe, the boundary, its main job is to keep my emotional climate intact. If I go boundaryless, it means I'm allowing my emotional climate to kind of spew out, and now I'm blaming and attacking others. And the same way, if I go boundaryless, now I'm allowing someone else's emotional climate to change mine. And when I see couples in my office arguing, one of the biggest things we work on, almost as a way of triaging and putting pressure on the wound, if you will, is we talk about this boundary system that says, I'm in charge of managing my emotional reactions to who you are and what you're saying, and so are you. And in this place where we can talk about our pain, our wounding, our challenges, by when we can do that and hold our emotional climate intact, that's when we are most powerful in relationships to go through the repair process. Another way that we violate our boundaries is by using something called negative control. Negative control can be thought of like this invisible poker where we provoke someone into soothing who we are. It could be the passive aggressive text. It could be a silent treatment. It could be, oh, babe, don't you love me? That's the provocation for the partner to then say, yes, babe, I love you. And negative control will always shoot us in the foot because the person we're trying to provoke into soothing us actually feels poked. And the one thing that they will do is cut off from us. So we keep up this more sophisticated, more refined way of doing negative control, which shoots us in the foot because the narrative here is if I stop provoking them into loving me, then our relationship will fall apart. And if we're in that place, what we're experiencing is something called low relational esteem. If I don't do negative control, we fall apart. So keep up this subtle way of saying, ta-da, do you still love me? Ta-da, do you still love me? And now we're part of that dreamer performer cycle.
And I think just as a little side note, this again, we just wanted to make sure that you all had access to information because we're really passionate about this. But at the very bottom, you're going to see a chart that Isaac created called the 6 core wounds. Again, it's something to kind of give you a little bit of information around some of the things that you might be prompted to do in an effort to try to kind of essentially meet these innocent emotional cravings that we all have. So that's just something for you to be able to reference. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go over it in great detail now, but we wanted you to be able to have it. So kind of wrapping up a little bit on this part, there's going to be, a lot of ways in finding healing and security. And I think, Isaac and I are both believers that a lot of that actually happens in relationship. It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. In fact, it can be any type of relationship. It probably will be any type of relationship. But one little thing that I want to put out there is just this process, right, that happens, which is the attach, break, repair cycle, and recognizing that's actually really hopeful. It's literally seen within our entire world, as people who identify as Christians, kind of the concept of who Christ was and who God is this idea of attach, right? And then there's a break, but then there's an answer and there's a repair in that relationship. And then that actually makes the relationship even stronger. A metaphor I like talking about a lot is that, if you break a bone and you set it properly, then when it heals, it actually becomes even stronger where it broke than every other place. And so it's remembering and kind of keeping that in mind when there's that feeling of like, I don't want to go there. I'm nervous. I'm scared. I don't want to have conflict, or I don't want to process through things. That the repair piece is crucial, right? If you don't ever set the bone, it's never going to heal. And I think that's what a lot of us grow up in, just because people don't know. And I think I meant to make this disclaimer a little earlier, is that we're definitely not in the position of trying to like blame everybody or blame our parents or move into that space at all. It's all through a compassionate lens of we're all just like people on this planet trying to help one another, and we're in relationship with one another, and we don't know what we don't know. And so knowing is a huge part of this. But learning how to repair and learning how to repair in your relationships is really important. And that means that sense of more than just an apology, we actually like see and understand one another and we get it. And then there's some sort of intention that happens or accountability that happens from that space that restores peace. but then also it gives you that sense of like, oh, okay, like we're okay, and I actually know we're okay. So that's something to just keep in mind, something that we see all over the world, right? And then I think it's just really important to realize that, you know, awareness of where you're at on the attachment spectrum can just help you to realize like, okay, there's some things I can do to move more toward this earned secure attachment, and kind of move more toward that middle space. We put in this outline just some things to consider, because the other piece that a lot of times we don't realize or that we take for granted is that we're in relationship to everything. We are relational beings. And so it can be helpful to use this framework to think about it beyond just human relationships. Like, what is my attachment to God? What's my attachment within my family? What's my attachment to sex? What's my attachment to time or money and resources that I'm dependent on? And how does that show up? And how can I kind of move a little bit more toward, you know, that earned secure attachment, or that middle space within that? And I think, you know, within all of this, just the message that you can have the relationships that you want. Isaac and I are both so deeply passionate about empowering people within the world, but most especially people who identify as queer, to be able to thrive and live just really inspiring lives. I think there's a possibility that, you know, one day, right, it could be one of those things where it's like, oh wow, we have a lot to learn about relationship from people who identify within this population, because they're actually doing work to make it happen. And so we just want that message to be out there, that you can have this, you can have positive relationship. And even though we don't see that in the media, and we don't see that very often as an encouraging message, it really is possible.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. I think one of the biggest things about the like attach, break, and repair process is the vulnerability that it requires. Because I think that's life-changing to say, hey, I just showed up as a dreamer or a performer and I fractured our attachment, and I want to talk about that. Can we please repair? I think that process, in whatever way that comes across, is just so incredibly powerful. Do you want to move to the Q&A?
For sure.
There?
Yep.
Cool.
Awesome.
Okay. When one recognizes enmeshment and performance and changes the pattern, it can lead to conflict when the other with the other party. When it is possible to continue relationship, and for the relationship, if only one person recognizes unhealthy patterns and make changes, but the other person does not recognize the dysfunction or the patterns of relating. I think we might have different insight on this, but one of my kind of go-to golden standards is to say in relationships, if I'm changing and you're not, I can tolerate that for a little bit, but I'm going to need you to move towards that middle ground, like Jamie was saying. And as long as I see, this is my personal kind of take here, what I need in relationships, if I see the people around me with whom I'm in relationships slowly moving towards that middle part, that is enough for me. I can hang out there and have compassion there. I oftentimes see from a clinical side, if we have one performer or dreamer and one person is making change but the other person isn't, what I oftentimes see is an inflammation. It can actually get worse for a little while until the other person finally has this breaking point of saying, okay, you've exposed all of the faults within my behavior. Now I'm willing to change. And of course, we all hope that that happens.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think again, this can be a space of bravery where it's a revealer of the relationships. A lot of what Isaac said, it's that what's the intention behind it? So it's not putting something out there where it's like, hey, by tomorrow you need to be more secure, right? That's just not going to happen. But it's kind of really realizing what are those checkpoints and evidences, right? That this is something that you both are trying to hold, because otherwise it does kind of tilt, right? If I'm trying to hold up this one side but the other person isn't, it will feel wobbly and it will feel bad, and you'll be pulled back into cycles pretty often. so there is mutual integrity and accountability in any form of relationship, and when you're doing your part and focusing on your part and not trying to like focus on, you know, hey, that you need to do this before I do this, that will be a revealer, right? And maybe it's a revealer that the relationship isn't the right relationship for a long period of time, which is painful, but it's kind of better to know. So, you know, it's not a simple answer, but that's what I would say in addition.
We'll move on to a question by Molly. Can you discuss how purity culture may make people either avoidant or anxious in their attachments? I do see that. I think purity culture is a very, very good example of enmeshment. It's the whole premise is to say, if you follow these rules and do this right, you keep God happy with who you are, and you will be healthier because of it. That gives us the perception, I need to abide by these rules so that I'm a spectacular specimen before God. I think the attachment piece here is, and you can help me out, but the way that I think about attachments is that it will determine your interpretation and your perception, your reaction to purity culture, and how that will kind of combine with the attachment style you already have. Attachment style is predominantly set in stone before your first birthday. And so anything after that, like purity culture, will just kind of add to the angst if you're anxious, or the avoidance if you're avoidant.
Most definitely. Yeah, I think that's really well said. And also, you may know this, but Isaac's doing a breakout later on forming sexual ethic. And I think that would actually provide a lot more in-depth permission around understanding how do you form kind of your own security with your sexuality, right? As opposed to how it's been influenced by these dominant kind of cultural narratives. So I think I'd recommend that for sure. We did have a question from an anonymous attendee, said, I can relate to a lot of what's being discussed here. Any strategies for finding a therapist that understands these things? Any other resources that you can recommend if I want to go deeper? And for sure, I think depending on where you are located, if you do, you know, some kind of local search for a therapist, making sure that they're informed around attachment theory and that they're actually not just LGBTQ friendly, but like aware and educated, so that way you don't have to kind of, you know, filter through all of that, would be really beneficial. If you're here in Colorado, iAmClinic is a really great resource for you. That's what Isaac and I could direct. And then we've actually launched for those folks who are wanting to kind of go deeper in the, you know, other states or internationally, iAmCounsel, and we have coaches who can kind of help you work through a lot of this stuff very specifically.
Yeah. There's another question. What if you don't fit into these categories because you've done a lot of work? That is absolutely possible. I think that's what the earned secure attachment looks like. I still find, after years of studying and working on my attachments and performer dreamer energy, that I can still kind of dip into them. So I have to pull myself back out. So absolutely. There was one other question of what does remembering look like? I think for me, remembering is a practice of vulnerability. I'm going to set aside all of my ta-das, all of the parts of me that I think are spectacular. And I'm going to pick one person, Jamie, my other best friends, Ray and Michael, my sister, my mom and dad, and to say, I'm going to show up in this interaction without doing my normal ta-da. That's the vulnerability part, so that you can mirror back from me who I am when I'm authentic. And practicing that over and over again helps us receive the mirroring that we are still beautiful when we're not performing. But it also allows us to sew together our authenticity over time by doing that over and over and over again. We have like a couple of seconds, so we'll do one or more. But before we go, I just wanted to say thank you to our interpreters for helping us out before we get cut off.
Yes, exactly. And hopefully we'll be able to give you some more of the resources that you're kind of looking for in a follow-up. I think one thing I did want to answer is, as a neurodivergent person, do you have any tips for forming closer attachments with neurotypical people? I think that's going to be something that I would highly recommend working with a very skilled therapist around, only because it's going to help you to be able to kind of find that way in which the two of you can kind of sync up, right? so that both needs are kind of met in a way that really creates, space for that. I think, ultimately getting to a space of understanding is going to be the very beginning part of that.
For sure. I think one last, if you do find that you're a victim, we're kind of answering one of the questions here, and
Right.
you find yourself kind of avoiding relationships or kind of sabotaging them. I think one way to break the cycle, if you're kind of ghosting people or being blocked or experiencing a lot of detachment, I really find that finding a trustworthy person who can walk through with you. I like to describe vulnerability as saying, here's a little piece of my vulnerability, and if you respect it, I'll give you the next one. And this is how we share ourselves in bigger and bigger increments. And a trustworthy person will be able to affirm and mirror you and help you go through those breaks of the fear, the rejection, the pain, and they will hold it long enough until it becomes that earned secure attachment. That's a very short answer. But I do think that coaching is always a good option. We're also going to start an e-school, so we're going to walk through these charts a lot more. If you want to follow along with what we're doing here, you can always email us at info@iamclinic.org, and Nicole will get you on our email list. You can always reach out, isaac@iamclinic.org. Any questions, follow up. I would love to hop on a call and go through these charts. It's I love it. That's why I'm here. So yeah. Thanks to all the QCF staff and the interpreters and everybody for making this possible. Just love it. Yes. So yeah. Thank you. I think we're gonna